All right, welcome back, everybody. Should we do some quick introductions and then we'll get into talking about what's happening in the economy here in Nevada in regards to agriculture and take it from there. Tom, do you want to start?
Okay, my name's Tom Harris. I'm a professor in economics and I'm director of the University Center for Economic Development at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Malieka.
Hi, I'm Malieka Bordigioni. I'm a research manager at the University Center for Economic Development at UNR, and I also work on the FAPRI project.
And Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Helmar. I'm a research manager in the University Center for Economic Development and also in the Agricultural Experiment Station, and I work with Malieka on the FAPRI project.
Great. Malieka, let's start with you and talk about what we're seeing in regards to the supply chain as we are coping with this strange virus that's going around.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, our last couple video casts, we have talked about what's going on in the market, what people are seeing in the grocery store, and what producers are experiencing on the ground. We've talked about that it's not necessarily a demand issue for the products or a supply issue of the raw products, but it's really the piece in between, which is called the supply chain. So I want to describe a little bit more about that. Before I move to that, I do want to show two graphs that are from safegraph.com, and they take mobile data, cellular data, and look at foot traffic in different industries. So here is an image of the foot traffic in supermarkets since the beginning of the year. You can see we were kind of cruising along, very similar. 2019 is the orange line, 2020 is the blue line, and then as we move into February, it drops down, and then we see a big spike right around the time that states were starting to put restrictions on stay-at-home measures and this sort of thing. You see people going to grocery stores and stocking up, and then you sort of see a gradual decline, and we're at about 80% of where we were in 2019. And then you compare that to the foot traffic in sit-down restaurants, where you can see again there was a gap between 2019 and 2020, and then you see a drastic fall around the time that the stay-at-home measures were put on. So keep in mind that this is a very simplified version of a supply chain. This is looking at sheep produced for meat only. We know that sheep is often produced for wool as well, but we're just going to pretend like these sheep are produced for meat only. You can see we have the producer. The producer goes to the feedlot or the sales yard, ends up at the processor, goes to storage, and then goes into two distinct paths, resale paths. So we have a domestic path, which is the brown path, and we have the export path, which is the green path. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to set the export path aside and focus on the domestic path. And the domestic path, we see a retail path and a food service path. And one thing to notice is that along every step in the supply chain, you see these images, which are little trucks, right? So there's a lot of transportation that happens at each stage of the supply chain. When the producer moves into either the feedlot or the sales yard, there is a supply and demand for each stage of this supply chain too. This is sort of what we call in economics like a derived demand. So with the supply chain going from the producer to the sales, the demand that the producer is seeing is from the consumer on the far end, but he supplies the feedlot. The feedlot then supplies the processor, and the demand is going towards either the retail or the food service line. One of the things to keep in mind when we are looking at this processing is that there are there's different types of processing. Processing might be just for slaughter, for the whole slab of beef or pork, or it might be processed further into ready to eat. When the ready to eat or ready to sell is processed, that is broken down even further into a retail path for an at-home consumer, or a commercial path, which would be a more industrial use or commercial use in a restaurant, or for further food preparation. This is where the place where we're seeing the real choke point is in this processing line. Many of these processors have a dedicated line that they have set up. So they're set up to either process just for that slab, just to do the slaughter, or they're processed to do the packaging. And then the ones that are set up to do the packaging are set up to either do smaller packages for retail or larger packages for the commercial side. Switching this type of processing is very time consuming. It's not something that can be done quickly overnight, and it's not done inexpensively either. These are it's almost a type of high-tech manufacturing where you have machines that are built and dedicated to packaging a certain size for a certain end-line consumer. This choke point in the processor is where we're really seeing the differences in the prices that the producers are receiving when they funnel into the processor and what the consumer is paying on the outside. Taking all of the processors offline that were supplying commercial takes a lot of capacity out of the processing portion of the supply chain. That supply chain then backs up on the producer side as they're not able to supply as many animals through to the processor, and things back up on that side. At the same time, we are not seeing the commercial has not come back yet during this COVID crisis. So everything's having to go through the retail. And as everyone is aware, there's a very high demand for many cuts of meat at the retail level. And so we're seeing a shortage there. That's creating a real price differential between the producer supplying the processor and the demand that's coming in from the retail side. Further complicating this supply chain is all of the transportation that happens from the producer to the feedlot to the processor to the different retail, and finally to the consumer. We have transportation that's down because of travel restrictions, because of illnesses. We also have a lot of processing plants we see in the Midwest, such as Iowa, that they are backed up because they're specific to different logistics hubs and distribution. And this is really what is causing a lot of the challenges in what our supply chain is. And with that, I will pass it off to Mike to talk a little bit more about how this impacts Nevada specifically.
Take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Malieka. Thanks, Bob. We're going to talk a little bit about how things are going on in Nevada. Now, one thing we need to remember is that Nevada agricultural production and revenues from agriculture are more dependent on national and international markets than they are on the domestic market. For our beef, maybe not quite as much for our, well, of course, for our fluid milk, not. That's always a local market thing. But for our processed milk, for our lamb and wool, those things are very, very much dependent on national and international markets. The hay market, of course, we do export some into California and some overseas as well, but most of our hay, although it is consumed domestically, it basically is for feeding those animals and getting the milk that we need to process, that we ship out of state anyway. So even the hay markets are very much dependent on national and international markets. I'm going to start off by talking about some feeder steers. We're going to look at our feeder cattle prices, what they've done since since about the middle of December. I'm going to back that far so we can see that between the middle of December and about the middle of January or so, the prices were, you know, other than weekly and daily fluctuations in them, were pretty stable with feeder cattle at that level. And then along about the middle of January, we started to see some noise coming out of China. They dipped. But by the time we got around to the end of January, the 1st of February, the 1st of February, we saw a drop. Things started to get a little more scary with the coronavirus, and some international markets, like the Chinese market, started to dry up, and we dropped some prices, but we kind of held in there until about the middle of February, where things really started to go south for our U.S. cattle producers. Were towards the end of February and into March. In fact, the prices dropped considerably. We've got a couple things going on at that period of time. One is the fact that we saw we began to stay in place at home, and the demand, as Malieka was saying, wasn't being met, and so that means that the cattle were kind of being backed up into the top end of the supply chain, which is, you know, towards the producer side, and that kind of pushed those feeder cattle prices down, while the retail prices, as Malieka said, were going up, and then they fluctuated a little bit. The market was trying to feel its way out, see what was going to happen with it, where the supplies were going to go. And they popped up a little bit by about the middle of March, but then they dropped quite a bit as we got into the early April, and they've come back up and kind of stabilized in the last few weeks. I just want to make a short comment about that. Are we into a period where we've stabilized, where the allocation or the rationing of the resources is getting at least consistent among all places? Or are we ready for another drop? Have we hit the bottom that we're going to be at? There are a couple of things that suggest that maybe that's not the case. Processors are still closing, even though this is somewhat offset by a few other plants that are opening, at least on a limited place in both the pork and the beef industries. So I don't know that these have found a bottom unless more of the plants reopen. But if we say they have found a bottom, that's maybe an optimistic statement, and I think we want to put a limit on that. And one of the things is, at least very recently, we've seen that slaughter for cattle is down both week on week. You know, from a week ago, the slaughter at slaughter plants was down by about 2%, and it's down a lot year on year. Slaughter is down over 20% compared to the same time a year ago. So the supply chain backlogs continue. Those choke points are still there as cattle and beef don't move through the system. So that's what we're looking at right now. And we're now at this point in time, even though we've recovered some, we're still about 18 to 19% below the high point on this chart, which would have been at about early in 2020. We're still about 18% down on our feeder cattle prices. So we've come back up a little bit, but we're not there yet. I want to give a little bit of a Nevada flavor to this here, and we've got some. And this is from the sources from an organization called CattleRange.com, and they provide weekly feeder cattle prices for most of the states that produce a lot of feeder cattle, and they have it by regions. And they've got Nevada in here, which is really good because a lot of places don't carry Nevada prices. But I want to talk about this a little bit. And as you can see, the first set of bars here is this week, or it's actually late last week, is their last report. The purple bars are the average, like the national average feeder cattle prices, and the orange bars are Nevada. You can see that Nevada is consistently a little below the national average. And that's right, we are, because we don't process, or we don't feed a lot of cattle in this state. We ship them out. So we have a transportation cost to those major feeding areas in it. So we're always a little below the national average. And you can see that, you know, we talked a little bit about maybe we may have hit bottom, that we stabilized a little bit. This kind of implies maybe that too. So you can see the this week prices are actually have come up about 1% from last week. But though we're down from a month ago, so maybe we stabilized. But here's what I want to show everybody is the year ago prices. We are down substantially from a year ago at about 20 or so bucks per hundredweight for cattle across the board, both nationally and for Nevada. You know, like I said, Nevada follows the national averages very much. This is a period of time when we had expected those cattle prices to be consistent with what they were a year ago. We were kind of towards the top of that price cycle, maybe even a little above in 2020 is the top point of our price cycle. But you can see that we're not there. We're well below that. And then we go back to the 5-year average, and that 5-year average, and we don't have that number for Nevada, but I think the pattern suggests that even with the 5-year average, that we would be slightly below the national average. We're well below the 5-year average, and that's actually kind of where we would normally be this year is at the 5-year average. So you can see that we're off by 16, 18%, 20% on our cattle prices. So this is what it looks like, not only in the last few months, but this is kind of gives us a medium-term and a long-term view of our cattle prices. This should have been a good year for our cattle producers, but because of the coronavirus, they're going to be hurting real badly, maybe much or worse than they were in 2016, which was the bottom of that price cycle. So that's the situation that we're in right now. I want to then turn and talk a little bit about the milk prices that we've talked about, and this goes back. This has got the same dates as the similar chart for feeder steer prices. It goes from about the middle of December up to this time, just yesterday or the day before. And you can see that it's kind of had the same time period where it showed big drops, long about the beginning of the year, and then it moved into early March and it dropped again. But what's happened in early April is our milk prices have fallen right off a cliff. We're down about $6 per hundredweight from where we were at the beginning of the year, and that's 30 some odd percent in milk prices. So what's driving that? Well, we've got a couple of or several paths that milk can take. One, of course, is the local demand from consumer demand for fluid milk, for our bottlers and things of that nature. And I'm still drinking as much milk as I did before, and many people are. However, we've got things like some of the institutional demand for milk. The schools that ran breakfast and lunch menus, they're not feeding them. I know that the schools are saying we're open for the kids. They can come by and pick up stuff, but the kids aren't driving, but their parents aren't. The parents aren't taking advantage of that to a very large extent. So that's a big demand. Other things like ice cream out at fast food places and things like that. That demand is well down. I haven't gotten to go get my Dairy Queen Blizzard, so I'm not able to do that. And whatever products that you like. So that sort of demand is down as well. But having said that, you'd think that there would be plenty of fluid milk on hand. If you go to the grocery store, and about the last time I went to the grocery store about a week and a half ago, it was limiting, at least in the store that I go to, it was limiting milk was 1 per customer. The other day that I went about 10 days apart, there was no longer a limit on that milk. So it seems like that may have been alleviated. We're getting supplies into the stores again. I don't know if it's across the board or not, but there are some limits on that. They're keeping people from trying to hoard. Well, it's kind of hard to hoard milk because it's only got a shelf life. you know, a few days shelf life. But that same feature means that people need to go back and buy milk more often, and apparently they're not quite doing that. And something similar has been happening with eggs too. So that's kind of the demand side of it. But if we look at the supply side of milk, if we can't move it through the bottlers, if they're not moving quite as much through because of the institutional loss, the manufacturers aren't moving as much through because the demand for those products has dried up to a certain extent. We have a whole lot of milk being produced. A dairy producer cannot decide not to milk his cows for a few days. They've just got to be milked every day. So that supply of milk is always going to be there. It's very, very inelastic. So he's got a whole bunch of milk sitting there and not the demand for it. And this is what has caused that big drop, particularly in the last month in the producer milk prices. There's very little he can do about it other than the things that we see in the news. So what are they? We've heard about milk being dumped in a lot of parts of the country. California has some producers that were for manufacturing, for cheese production. Their cheese demand has dried up on them. They've had to dump milk. I mean, a lot of milk. So there's milk dumping. And then in Nevada, anecdotally, I've heard that there have been a few producers who have reduced herd size, have sold off some cows. That was a relatively small amount, what I heard about, but it's been a week or so since I've heard that, and I don't know if that's increased now. But those are efforts at reducing the supply that are going out there because the prices are so low. While producers if they're just dumping milk and still milking, they're still feeding those cows. If you're reducing the herd size, you're feeding, you know, a few less cows, and so you're helping your costs a little bit there. But the supply side is still running full bore, whereas the demand side is not. Now, so like I said, nationally, prices are off about $6 a hundredweight since the middle of December. That's a national thing. Now, again, anecdotally, what I've heard is that in Nevada, it hasn't been quite that bad because, particularly northern Nevada, because of our whole milk powder plant in Fallon and the fact that they've had contracts with producers that have guaranteed some prices in them. That can't go on forever. New contracts will be made. But it has helped our producers a little bit, although some of them have had to rationalize their milk production to a certain extent. So what is going on with that plant? Well, if they're still producing, if we look at their product, their whole milk powder, the major export destination is China. And China imports of whole milk powder from the US are actually up, I've got a chart here, a little bit from a year ago. If you can see out the very last bar, the 2020 JF, that's a January to February. That's the amount of data that's there. So for this year, whereas the whole milk powder exports were close to zero a year ago, they're up to, if you were to seasonalize that, that would be about $6 million of milk exports if you were to annualize that. I don't know if we can quite do that. But even at that, that's only back where we were for all of 2019, maybe a little above it, and well below we were at our peaks in 2018 and 17. We've got New Zealand competing against us always in that market. They're the big dog in that one. So even though we're up a little bit early this year, and that will help our producers and help that milk plant run, they're still not real high. So that's a big risk for our Nevada producers. Having said that, our whole milk powder plant is not just a whole milk powder plant. They do have the abilities to switch to skim milk powder production in that. And that's a much larger market, and it's not just for American producers, it's not just an international market. So we can, if they do produce the whole skim milk powder, they can be marketed domestically. So that's a bigger market that we can move into, even though it will be limited as well, but it gives a little bit of a wiggle room there. Those are kind of the things that I wanted to cover with what's going on in Nevada this week. It is still a dairy and beef cattle story. The wool, the lamb, of course, that demand is down, and the wool demand is down. International story, again, we are stuck with international markets for our wool pricing. Not that we don't market it in the US, but for our wool pricing from the Australian prices. That stabilized a little bit in the last couple of weeks, but that's because China did another one of its jump in for a couple of days, and now it seems like it's back out. So even those markets are down. So it looks like very temporarily we may have stabilized. Let's hope we've hit the bottom, but be prepared for more price declines and revenue declines for our producers. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Quick question for you. The governor did announce yesterday that schools would be closed through the academic year. And we know that school children are big consumers of milk. What kind of impacts do you see on that? I mean, it sounds like at least we now have a finite date for that aspect of milk demand.
Yeah, that it'll be just kind of more of the same of what's happened since the schools have been closed down. That part of that demand just is not going to come back until the fall. And like I said, we're at a period of time when we're having more milk come on board because dairy calves are being born at this time of year, and so that more milk is coming on board. So between that loss of the school demand, that's going to keep that fluid milk price. Well, even though fluid milk prices do not fluctuate on the market like a lot of the products do, there are some price controls, for lack of a better word, that help hold those prices in place. But the amount of fluid milk that is being taken off is much lower, and that pushes it back into other markets, the processing.
Great. And Stacy, thanks for joining us. Did you want to do a brief introduction? Do you have anything to add?
No, I don't. I just, I think I put in the chat questions that we continue to see those declines at the sale yard and cattle. So we are seeing those declines. I mean, you know, we're right above $1, and I look for some of those prices to drop below that as we go through this summer months. So just so we know, we're continuing to starting to see that. We really won't know for hay until we have it and people start trying to sell it. So
yeah, and you're right, Stacy. That's reflected in the slaughter numbers being down this week and being down from that. And so that's why I'm making sure that we temper any optimism we have, because if we can't get those animals moved through the slaughter and packing stages, they're just gonna back up, and in order for a sale yard to move them out, they're just gonna have to push those prices down. You're absolutely right.
And while we may not see price relief in terms of shifting markets in the near future, there are a couple of federal assistance programs that were announced recently, and they're coming online. One is the $16 billion in direct payments. I think $5 billion has been earmarked for cattle producers. I think about 3 million, just a little bit short of 3 million, has been earmarked for dairy producers. About 9 billion, I'm saying million, 9 billion for livestock industry in general. And then in addition to that, there's also 3 billion earmarked for a harvest box type program where they're going to buy meat, milk, and specialty crops or food crops from producers to supply to food banks and perhaps like school lunch programs and that sort of thing. Those things may not take place for a few more weeks though, so there is going to be a slight delay, but there will be some, at least hopefully a little bit of farm income relief in the near future.
Also, hey Bob, I know Malieka's seen this thing they had in Purdue. There's there's been a lot of people sick in these major packing plants, which influence, and immigration is not going to be we're not going to see many people come in. Many plants are being closed and have to be sanitized and all that. But as a ready supply of labor in a lot of ag, they're really having some problems getting ag labor to work in the packing plants and even, pick crops. So that labor is going to be that. And even kind of all over, would any of us 10 years ago ever think oil will be selling for a negative $30 a barrel? It doesn't impact the ag sector, but it's an aurora that goes over the whole commodity market when you get things like that happening. And places like Alaska and Texas and Oklahoma, which have a lot of their state funds are from oil sales, which also are funds for schools, that's going to impact milk sales down the road because of that. So it's a whole lot of things going on at the same time. They're make us realize how everything's linked together in this production process, but also ag labor, which is going to be a big thing.
Thank you all so much. Any final thoughts before we hang up for the day?
Yeah, there's one other thing that I want to keep an eye on that I looked at last week or so, and I was surprised that it was still holding up, and that was the number of cattle on feed and cattle placements. They were still holding up from a year ago. If those feedlots, for example, aren't able to move cattle out, finished cattle out of it, there's only so much capacity there they have. When they reach that full capacity, there won't be the ability to put cattle on feed anymore. That pushes back on the feeder steers, those prices too. So if we can't move that stuff out of the feedlots and into the slaughterhouses, it's going to be another round of negative price pressure.
Thank you all. Not always happy news, but at least we're getting some reliable information out there to make some hopefully informed choices in this weird time we live in. So thank you.